name's Dan Lizette. This, of course, is the Podcast Digest, and thank you again for taking just a little bit of your time to listen to another installment of this show where I try to find the best shows for you to fill your subscription list with. The last few weeks have been excellent. I hope you guys have enjoyed the recent recommendation episodes as well as some of the great interviews I've been trying to bring to you, and that's exactly what I've got for you guys again this week. This gentleman had reached out to me and let me know of his show, and as I am wont to do, I then started to check it out and immediately was hooked on Arrvls. It's from creator Jonathan Hirsch, and Jonathan has joined us this week on the Podcast Digest. Jonathan, welcome.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much for joining me. I know that you've been putting in a lot of work into your show, and I really want as many people possible to find out about it because, as I mentioned, I've really enjoyed it. When you reached out, I'm not sure exactly the first one I listened to, but when I did, I immediately went back to the beginning and plowed through each and every one of the episodes. And folks, this is something that is released every 2 weeks, Jonathan?
Yeah, every other week. And thank you. That's very nice of you. I'm glad that you're enjoying it.
And the episode lengths are not that long, so this is, as I like to say, is not something that will pollute your feed. It's very consumable and very enjoyable. But rather than hear from me, Jonathan, for folks who have not heard Arrvls yet, tell them a little bit about the show.
Yeah, sure. So Arrvls is it's a story-driven show, and we like to say that it's about amazing men and women, everyday people who have experienced some kind of unexpected change in their life. And the themes that we've sort of isolated that have become part of the structure of the show is migration, transformation, and change. And I can explain a little bit sort of what we mean by that. So a migration could be anything. It could be crossing boundaries. It could be travel. It could be a journey. And a transformation for us is any kind of internal change in your life when a sudden change of heart, a realization of some kind. And then change is just the physical event, things that happen that you don't expect to have happen. A plane dying when you're in the middle of the air and crashing to the ground, or an unexpected accident or occurrence in the environment that you could have never expected. So I felt that those three themes were the primary ways that I found in which everyday people experienced very profound changes in their lives that shifted the way that they looked at their future. We have these expectations and ideas about our lives that are totally natural, that are based on an accumulation of various different experiences. But then there's these moments that punctuate the normalcy of our lives, these moments that take all of our expectations of the future and what's ahead and turn it on its head. And I feel like in those moments when unexpected change happened to us, we change in really amazing ways and we do really surprising things. And so I've tried to find stories of people who have experienced some kind of unexpected change in their life and find that moment when they experience that change and share it with the world. And those moments I've discovered have been really quite remarkable.
It's such a unique concept for a show, and it's targeting that element of human experience as you describe it that I'm not sure there are a ton of other storytelling-based shows that really focus in on that, and that could be one of the reasons I find it so interesting. But let's go back in time a little bit, Jonathan, way back to before this show even began. Tell us about the genesis of the idea. Was it just you always wanted a podcast and you searched for subject matter, or sort of what's the background? What was the story up to the first release?
Yeah, sure. So it's a very personal story, and I found in talking to a lot of podcasters and a lot of people in this medium now that it's really amazing to me how many people I've met for whom getting into this medium was a very, very personal thing. It's a very kind of like, it's kind of like when people first started making records in their bedroom. There's something very personal and bedroomy about recording your own show and putting it on the internet. And the genesis of my involvement in Arrvls is very much the same. My wife and I are from the San Francisco Bay Area. And we had lived out there for about 6 or 7 years, and we got this idea right before we got married that we would travel all over the country and then all over Europe and then move to New York We had both wanted to live in New York for a really long time. And so we decided to do it. We left all our friends and our family that lives in the Bay Area, and we traveled. And then we arrived in New York about a year and a half ago. And like a lot of people who first moved to New York, it's not the easiest thing for a number of reasons. It's a really hard city to make it in. But I found myself in a particularly difficult situation. And I ended up walking out on a job that I had. And it was for, very personal reasons. It just was a very difficult time. And I wasn't really sure what I was going to do next. So I basically had this really terrible job. And I was calling my wife every day on the phone being like, oh my God, I got to get out of this place. This is really, really terrible. And after a while of, day after day of calling her on my lunch break, she was like, it sounds like you should probably just go, but maybe you should find something else first. So I got the first job that I could find. Just a friend got me a job somewhere at a restaurant. And I walked out and I never looked back. And as I was heading home that afternoon, I got onto the subway back to my apartment. I decided to pop into a bar where my friend worked and just to talk to him about what had happened. And so I walk over to the bar and he's not there, but there's another guy there. And the guy there, I sit down, it's just me and him in the bar. And I sit down and I tell him that I quit my job. And it turns out that bartenders are, it's a line of work that's particularly accustomed to people walking in and saying, I just quit my job today.
Right.
So he,
heard that one.
Yeah, exactly. So he sort of had a stock answer for that, which was something to the effect of, hey, congratulations. And so I asked him about it. And I remember that moment still very clear. It's just I felt very confused about my life. Like we had this very comfortable life in San Francisco, and we had moved to New York. And now I was 30 years old and recently married and basically without full-time employment. And I knew I was going to be all right, but I just had no idea where, what the next step was for me. And I felt very sort of disoriented. And so I sit down and I wanted to know something. I definitely felt like I was in a place in that moment in my life where I was searching for something. And I asked the man at the bar to tell me more about, why he would say something like congratulations to somebody who just quit their job. And we ended up dropping into this conversation about a period in his life where he had worked in a really, really difficult job. He had been working in a day placement facility for adults with violent tendencies. He had gotten a degree in psychology and was looking for work in the field and ended up working at this day placement facility, which was a very, very, very difficult thing to do. And he sort of went through the whole grueling process of working in that job and how hard it was for him and what he learned from it. And I don't know, it was like something was churning inside of me as I was listening to him talk, and what I started to feel towards the end of the conversation, which probably went on for about 45 minutes, was that this stranger and I shared something amazing that I couldn't quite put my finger on. But I did know that if I kept asking him questions, I felt like I was going to get answers that I needed for myself. And so I kept asking questions and we kept talking. And at the end of it, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do next, but I just asked him very sheepishly if he wouldn't mind coming over to my house that weekend and letting me interview him. And he said yes. And that was sort of the very beginning of starting the show, was that conversation in a bar the day after I quit my job.
And that conversation became an episode, did it not?
It did, yeah. That's episode 2 of Arrvls. Yeah. It's called Fresh Out, and it tells the story. Joshua Levy is the guest, and he tells the story of his experience in that day placement facility.
So when you walked into the bar that day, there was no thought in your mind that you may eventually come out of that bar with the seeds to start a podcast?
Not at all. No, it was definitely not even remotely within my frame of mind at the time, which is why I think I oftentimes tell people that even the concept of Arrvls is a very personal one for me, because it was born out of this sort of chance moment when I myself felt that I had wound up in a place I didn't expect to be.
What's interesting is I want to mention a show that I recommended a long time ago, and it's a big one, and maybe some people have heard about it, but it's interesting because I think you guys are corollaries in a sense. Brian Koppelman, who recently left Grantland and is now with Slate, releasing his podcast called The Moment. Mm-hmm. And he interviews a lot of big names, writers, comedians, so on and so forth. And his whole thing is to talk about the moment somebody faced difficulty and what's unique in them that allowed them to get through that and then ultimately be successful.
Right.
It seems like the concept, or at least in part, of Arrvls sort of takes a similar vein, but from a different angle, where that person then tells the story themselves. Right. And that storytelling is what really sets Arrvls apart. The process of production for these episodes, anyone who's listening to this show should have already looked in iTunes or their podcast app and subscribed to Arrvls. And I should mention, you did some unique things with the spelling. Show title, Arrvls.
Yes.
So when you search for that, look for it that way. Links will be in the show notes, guys. But people will immediately find out this is a highly produced, very polished, well-done production. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is taking these interviews and turning them into what we hear?
Yeah, and I should mention too that I haven't listened to them. I haven't actually listened to The Moment, and you're the first person to mention it to me. So I'm really looking forward to checking that out.
It's excellent.
I'm very much looking forward to hearing that. And I mean, for all the same reasons, I'm just as interested in finding out about the outcome of these people that I interview and of people who experience these profound changes as I hope my listeners are.
Yeah, and as a side note, Brian Koppelman is one of my idols for interviewing. His interview style is phenomenal, and I think he's one of the best interviewers in podcasts. So just as a side note, I think he's excellent. So, but tell us about this process.
Yeah, so I think we've evolved over time, and this started with just me in my bedroom and some editing software, learning editing software. And making my way through it. I should say that when I was living in the Bay Area, I played in bands, and I hosted a couple of literary events in the San Francisco area. So I have experience sort of with going to a lot of storytelling events and seeing a lot of performers and performing a little bit myself, and also with listening closely to music and being part of the production process, at least as a musician, in making songs. But I did not come to this medium with any experience in producing audio. This is something that I learned as I went along. So hopefully the quality is improving as we move forward. But basically we take an interview and I go into a room with somebody, and I have some basic ideas of where I want the conversation to go, but I want it to be entirely their own. And I tell people this, that I ask questions as we move through the interview, but my interest is in their story. So the questions are only ways for them to continue to tell their story in a stronger vein. And for the most part, I'm removed from the conversation once we edit it and make it part of the show. The intention there being that this is one person's voice, and I want their voice to come through, and I want them to tell the story exactly as they tell it in the moment, without the sort of reflection of my own perspective, with the exception of a few small, important moments in some of the stories where I intercede. So we take the raw interview, and then we edit out a lot of any of my conversational bits, and then we just try to find the best way to sort of shape the story in their own voice. All the stories, with the exception of 2, are in first person, in that person's voice.
And that ultimately ends up making a much more personal feeling, I guess, to the listener, because it is like they're hearing straight from the subject from the host, if you will.
Right. And then there's a production value that goes into that as well. So we put together, and by we, I should say, of course, that this did start with me, but shortly after I launched the show, I brought on a collaborator who is a producer here in Harlem. His name's Ben Cruz. And he's a producer mostly of like electronic music, of beats and hip hop, but he's an incredibly talented engineer as well. And so he's been involved in sort of how we sound design the shows. And now we have another producer working with us. Her name's Gabrielle Lewis, who also lives in Brooklyn. But for the most part, I would say maybe the first 2/3 of the first season, Ben and I would work together to sort of try to create an atmosphere with the music that reflected the story. Not to take sort of, I guess I'm not sure, what listeners might be familiar with, but there seems to me to be two very different ways to take music in a story in radio. And one's more of a traditional sort of old time, very obvious, direct way to design sound in a story. So when somebody walks into a door, walks into a room and opens a door, you hear the creaking of the door, you hear the patter of the footsteps, you hear the door opening and closing, right? That's one way of doing it. But there's also another way, I think that's a little bit more poetic, that looks at what those sounds do to people, what their impact is. So, for example, when you're flying 10,000 feet above the air in a plane, and the engine of the plane dies, and you hear the air passing through, and all you hear is the air conditioning. Like, that's a very particular sound. And if you were obviously sound designing something like that, you could make an engine turn off. You could get a sound of an engine turning off, right? And then you would have like a really loud whooshing sound. But then you can also just sort of look at what that sound feels like, and try to interpret other sounds or make other sounds that elicit that same feeling. This might sound very abstract, but if you listen to the episodes, I think you'll start to see there's all of these opportunities there for us to make very obvious sort of accents with sound, and we try not to do that. We try to be more subtle and more poetic with the way that we use sound. For lack of a better term, it's not always poetic, but just find a way to express the same things without being so obvious about it. And part of the reason that I like doing it that way is that it doesn't distract from the story. We want you to feel something with sound and with music, certainly, but we also know that the most important thing is the story that's right in front of you, and we want that to come through.
I think it's these abstract topics and this attention to detail and minutia and this stylistic choice you've made with the music that ultimately makes Arrvls its own flavor of storytelling, because folks know that I'm a huge advocate for the storytelling genre. I've been recommending more and more and talking to a lot more hosts and producers of podcasts in this type of genre, and it has always been a fascination for me of the process that goes into producing something like this, because it's so vastly different than my own show or several other shows that I listen to, and I know from having these conversations the immense amount of work and decisions in these conversations about these smaller topics that really make the difference, I think, in its totality when it ultimately becomes published. I wanted to talk with you, Jonathan, about another important component of this, as I'm sure you can testify to. Sure. And another thing that fascinates me is, how in the world do you decide on these topics, find these folks, decide what becomes an episode?
Right. Well, and at first it was very idiosyncratic. It was just like whatever was available to us in the moment, or whatever just seemed right, because we had all of the world of topics to choose from. But as you move through, you start to sort of clarify, because you can't do the same story twice. So, for example, I knew that I wanted to do a story about somebody who had survived a terrible disaster, and somebody who had some very clear vision in that disaster. And so that is sort of how I went about seeking out stories of plane crash survivors. I was just sitting here one day, and I thought to myself, it would be really great to tell. It would be really great to tell a story of somebody who has survived a plane crash and what that experience is like and what the thoughts are that go through their head. And so I started looking around on the internet and reaching out to various different groups to try to find a story that sort of that reflected this feeling that I imagined was out there, which is highly presumptuous of me to assume like that people feel certain things or that I should try to find an exact story. But you don't know where to start when you're just sort of dreaming this up, you know?
Right.
And that's when I found Robin Holleran. And Robin started a private group on Facebook about plane crash survivors. And so I had reached out to her directly, and we began to correspond. And what I found very quickly was that not only was this woman amazingly strong and had an incredible story to tell, but she was very articulate, and she saw it in a way that I don't think I ever imagined, that was so much deeper and so much more aligned with the themes of the show than I could have even put together in my own head. Thankfully, my guests are smarter than I am. So I went out. We decided to meet and record the show, and that became the subject of episode 3 of Arrvls, which is called Ricochet, which I'll encourage you to listen to. And she now released a book, an anthology of plane crash survivors. So once you do a story like that, you really can't do that story again. Not only because you don't want to repeat the content that you've done, but also in service to that person. Like, they've told an amazing story. Why would I tell another story about a similar experience unless it really was different? So yeah, your themes start to be limited. They also start to be more refined. And then some of it was very personal. So this might be an interesting story. I've started telling this story live too, because I think it's really neat that this can happen in our lives. But the first guest on Arrvl is a man named Ethan Hughes. And Ethan, if you listen to it, you'll hear, but Ethan gave away $100,000 inheritance that his family had given to him after a relative passed, and decided after he had given all this money away to bike across the country dressed as a superhero with a team of other superheroes and help people along the way. And in the process, he experienced a great deal of heartache, but then also redemption. And it's an incredible story that I never would have been able to find had I not been traveling on a train 15 years ago and met this man in his superhero costume. And at the time, I was a 15-year-old kid, and this very gregarious guy in a superhero costume was traveling to Oregon by train, and I thought that he was the coolest person I'd ever met. And we connected, and we talked, and we exchanged numbers, but it really didn't. After the train ride was over, nothing really came of it. It was only when I started the show that I first started to think about people that I had met in my life that had transformed themselves in some profound way or had experienced some kind of unexpected change. And I had remembered that he had gone through a pretty serious breakup, and he was telling me about it, at least just in passing. And so I had this picture of a man in a superhero costume traveling across the country, having just been broken up with. And I just had to know where this guy was and what he was doing. And so I combed the internet for quite some time to try to find him because he lives on an electricity-free farm in a rural part of Missouri. So he doesn't have the internet or a cell phone or a Twitter page or anything even remotely close to that. He doesn't even have electricity. So I found an interview with him that he had done via a podcast about 8 or 9 years earlier, that at the bottom of the interview had a phone number, a landline number. And so I called it and I left a message, and amazingly, he called me back a few days later, and it turns out that his mother lives in Gloucester, Massachusetts, just about an hour north of Boston, and that he was going to be up there in the near distant future. And so we planned to meet, and I recorded his story there. So some of it was luck,
Right.
and some of it was actively just trying to seek out some intuition that I had, that I needed a story of a particular kind, or just be walking down the street and be like, oh, they would just hit me. You know what I mean? And kind of the same way, like I wrote music for a very long time, and I still do, and I write a lot of the music for the show. The majority of it is music that I've composed, and when I used to write songs more frequently, I would have these moments when I'd just be walking down the street and it'd be like, oh, that'd be a really great line. And I know it's totally common, but I feel like the same for musicians at least, but I feel like the same thing happens now with stories, where I just have this moment where I just feel out of nowhere, or just as the end point of a series of considerations about the kinds of stories that we can do, something will come up, and then I just will become attached to the idea of finding a story that sort of relates to the theme in that particular way, and then seeking it out and seeing what happens.
What's becoming more and more obvious to me as I've spoke with, Phoebe Judge from Criminal, Kyle Jest from The Labs, Vanessa Lowe from Nocturne, and now yourself, is that it may be this, old adage that people mention that literally everybody has a story. And it seems like all these great storytelling style shows are finding amazing material in just about anybody. And there's even more shows where that's, evident in terms of This American Life or Snap Judgment. And even the last week's episode here on the Podcast Digest, I spoke with Dave Nailberg from Mortified. And he talks about, he had a very unique journey to what is now the Mortified podcast, and a lot of that was built off live shows. And I understand that has been something you have recently undertook.
Yeah, absolutely. Live performance has always been a big part of my life, and so live shows are certainly a huge part of storytelling productions in general. Like you said, with Mortified and virtually all the storytelling podcasts that are out there have some form of a live show at this point, or a live event. But I never really designed it that way. It just made sense to me that if I was going to do some kind of performance, that it would be performed live, even if it was recorded initially. And so when we started the podcast, it was definitely always in the back of my mind to do a live performance. And as we moved through the first season, we decided myself and Ben and Gabrielle started to design what that live performance would be like. And I'm really excited about it. I think what we're doing with live shows is going to be really great. We did our first one here in Brooklyn just a few weeks ago, and we're doing another one here in Brooklyn at Pete's Candy Store, which is a great venue in the Williamsburg area of Brooklyn in the middle of June, on June 22nd. And we're planning shows right now in Los Angeles and 2 in San Francisco, which is all really, really exciting. One thing that I've noticed about a lot of storytelling shows that are out there is when they do the live events, they're largely just story format. You get up there, you tell a story. Maybe there's like a backing band of some kind.
Right.
But I wanted us to do something really different. And I've felt that because, you probably already gathered, but I think I and I'm sure I overthink this, but I'm appealed by the idea of every part of the show arising out of something very organic, and I got involved in podcasting and storytelling in this medium, sort of by a melding of my various different interests in other fields, in literature, in performance, in music. And so I wanted our live events to sort of reflect a melding of genres. I didn't see it just being a selection of intimate stories, because that would be the podcast. I wanted the live event to have a different flair, and I wanted it to encompass all of the different ways in which podcasting has sort of expressed things that all of these platforms of creativity also do, but does it in this unique way. So what we've decided to do for the live events is we take a theme for every show, and we kind of think of them like bands think about sets. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. If you've ever, one of my favorite classical, post-classical composers is a man named Max Richter. And Max Richter has composed an incredible body of music over the last 20, 30 years. But when you see him live, he'll play just an album. And I thought that was so cool. So I saw him live at a venue called Le Poisson Rouge in New York recently, and he played one of his records. And I just thought that was so neat. And after I saw that, I was like, yeah, that's what we should do for Arrvls shows. We should play sets, the way that bands set up sets, instead of this idea that we have to sort of recreate the story format every single time we play. Our live shows are going to be sort of iterations on larger themes in different cities with different performers and different mediums. And what I mean by that is that we're going to have storytellers be part of the show, but we're also going to do live interviews. And we're also going to do recorded programming, like produced pieces, which can either be recreated live, or they can be recorded and listened to live with projections and other sort of multimedia effect. But the idea here is that we take a theme and we iterate upon it with people within the local creative community that we're performing the show in, and we do it the same way but different every time. So you can go to the same set and enjoy it because you like that set. But in another city, it could be a totally different set of performers that are exploring that theme in a different way. Much in the same way that the show explores different themes in different ways every time you sit down to listen to a guest on Arrvls. So yeah, that's kind of what we're doing for the live shows. I'm really excited about it. I'm sorry if that's a little complicated to explain, but
really unique concept of what was ringing through my mind here. And I'm sorry I keep drawing parallels, but they're compliments, believe me when I say them. But I'm not sure if you're familiar with the show Risk.
I've heard about it. I've been meaning to take a listen to it. It's a storytelling show. Yes.
Yep. Storytelling, and I think they have a lot of live events. I don't know if their live events are built around a theme, but their episode releases are built around the theme. So I'm not sure if they're just plucking different stories from different events and collecting them under one umbrella to publish an episode. But Risk sort of does the same type of thing. But although I will say Risk lives on a much edgier tone in terms of subject matter. This really is adult entertainment from Risk for sure. Not that that's a dissuading comment, just simply an enlightening one for anyone who may go out and try to find it. But it's sort of that same type of theory where it is a topic-driven concept. So the idea is, if I can just kind of explore this a little bit further. Sure. So prior episodes are going to be concepts that could potentially have live performances under the umbrella of an episode, so that an episode has turned into its own theme. Is that sort of where?
That's a really interesting idea. I'm not exactly, but I love that thought. Maybe that will be the future of Arrvls live events. So
you can have that one for free.
Yeah, thank you. I'll credit you.
I was just thinking that would be an interesting idea, right? Like, I think you have 8 episodes in the first season,
right? So
that you could almost, because you mentioned how you didn't want to sort of cover the same ground, where each one sort of had its unique element. You could almost break each episode down to its own theme, and then have each one of these. I don't know.
Yeah, that's very cool. And to some extent, I think that is sort of the inspiration behind creating a thematic-based live event. But let me explain it in a little bit more detail.
Okay.
So I'm not so abstract here. And please, bring me down off of a cloud if I continue in that way. I tend to do that. But so for June 22nd, we're doing a show on the theme of coming home. Okay. And the idea there was that oftentimes the place where we arrive in our lives, where we feel like we've really come to a place of clarity in the midst of, competing narratives about where our lives should go, that moment of clarity happens in our home, or what we define as our home. And sometimes the opposite happens. So, for example, going home can be just as much can elicit a sense of victory as much as it can elicit failure, and whatever that moment means for somebody says a lot about the themes of our show. So we decided to take the theme of coming home and explore it through a recorded, produced piece, through an interview, and through a live performance. And so our show on the 22nd will feature 3 different mediums of communication and performance, exploring this theme with different stories. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
That does make sense.
All right. Much more clear.
That does make sense.
Yeah. And so my hope is that we can use that same theme in different cities. So when we do a show in Los Angeles, we're going to use the same theme, but the performers are going to be different. Their stories are going to be different. And when we do the same thing in San Francisco, likewise. So we have an opportunity to renew each of these themes that we're beginning to develop with different performers in different cities.
It sounds really intriguing, and seriously, I would love to be able to attend one of these.
Yeah.
If you ever make it out to Philadelphia, please let me know.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely do one in Philly pretty soon. Yeah,
it sounds really intriguing to me. Back to the podcast itself, I wanted to talk about what's happening right now as people are listening to this. You are in your hiatus, if you will, between season 1 and 2. However, that does not mean there are not new things to listen to from Arrvls. Can you tell folks a little bit about what's going on?
Yeah, and this is sort of, I think, probably an important point to sort of to mention that we do these things in a lot of podcasters do this from their bedroom or from their closet, but we also have found through this medium a way to connect with one another, and there's an active communication, especially in the New York community of podcasters and producers. There's a lot of activity. People are really open to one another and very helpful. So you can learn a lot just by asking questions. And so having an opportunity to communicate and collaborate both within the local physical community of podcasters and producers in the New York City area, but then also online has expanded sort of the reach and the scope of all of our works. It really enriches both our production and our lives. And I have found this to be especially true for me. So what started as a very independent journey has expanded to a team of 3 and a community of people who I trust and who are supportive and are part of this budding storytelling podcasting community that's global, if nothing else. And so as I was making my way through the first season of shows, I ended up running across a whole host of incredible producers and storytellers, composers, sound designers. And I was just amazed at how many people were available for conversation and for collaboration and communication. And so I got this idea that as we were developing the next season, we should give them an opportunity, these people that I've met along the way, to take our stories and see what they make of it. Because I've never felt that the stories were mine to have. I think a lot of people, when they create a story, it's theirs and that's the end of it, even if it's somebody else is the subject of that story. And I wanted to disentangle that notion that I had any authorship over what was being created, because it's not my story, it's somebody else's. And so I had this idea that a way to sort of explore that disentanglement of the authorship of these documentary stories, and also to expand the program in the spirit of collaboration, I had the idea to ask a number of producers, sound designers, and composers to take episodes of Arrvls that they liked, their favorite episodes over the course of the first season, and to do whatever they would with them, with their craft and their style and their voice. And so we released our first sort of remix episode of Arrvls just this last week. And it's done by Brian Merrill Garcia, who produced the episode. And Brian is a Brooklyn-based producer, somebody that I had met through his show online, and then we met in person. We became friends. He has a show called Arrvls, and it's a very sound-rich, fictional podcast, a storytelling podcast. It's definitely very, it's experimental, it's visionary, it's different, it's very different, and I always liked it for that. And so he was one of the first people I thought of when this idea came to me. And so I asked him if he would take the first episode of Arrvls, The Blazing Echidna, the story of the man who gave away $100,000 to dress as a superhero and bike across the country. And I asked him to take it and do what he would with it. And he did. And he took it in a totally different direction. He focused on certain parts of the story that I didn't. He designed it in a way that I never would have imagined it should be designed. And I loved him for that. I thought it was absolutely great to hear somebody take the story in ways that I didn't see. And I hope that the audience then has the freedom to look at the story not just through my eyes, but through theirs. And maybe they saw some of the things that Brian did that I didn't. So that's kind of the idea behind the sort of remix episodes. We're calling them Standby. And we have a couple more before the release of the second season in June. So they'll be coming out every other week.
And kudos on this concept, Jonathan. Like so many other things you're doing with Arrvls, I don't know of another show who's taking their, inter-season breaks, if you will, in doing this type of approach. It's really unique, and it's a way to kind of keep the interest up while still not necessarily providing brand new material, but a brand new look at the material. And I think that's really an interesting way of handling these sort of season breaks.
Thanks, man. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask you this. The reception from listeners, what's it been like so far? What is the feedback you've received since putting this out in the world?
It's interesting. We've gotten a lot of really great responses from people. A lot of it's been personal, and I've been so grateful for that. A lot of the responses I receive from people are stories of their own. When we released Fresh Out, the episode about the man that I met in the bar who sort of was the inspiration for the beginning of the show, who had worked in a day placement facility, I received an email from a woman in Canada, I think she was in Ontario, who had also worked in a day placement facility. And it was a long, beautifully written story about her own struggles to sort of stay buoyant in a very sometimes difficult occupation. And I was so touched by that people had seen these stories and saw themselves in it, which is my deepest hope, that these stories, if anything, reflect my own sense of feeling that I see myself in other people's stories, and their changes and their transformations are almost kind of like healing for me. My hope is that our stories do the same for others. And so whenever we receive a personal story of unexpected change, migration, transformation, I'm always so heartened. So a lot of the responses that I've received, the majority of them have been really just personal addresses about their own experience that sort of reflected something that had happened in one of the episodes.
I think there's such a level of comfort achieved by the fact that there's knowledge of a shared experience.
Right.
And I think for some of those folks, that's probably what you're seeing, folks who may have thought they were in such a blazing minority that, there's very few people suffering as much as I am, or have experienced something as traumatic or life-changing or whatever, and then for them to hear in their earbuds, probably unexpectedly, that they're not alone, can cause people to reach out.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's been absolutely, it's been amazing and very heartening to hear that.
Excellent. That's when you know that the work you're doing is meaningful and has an impact, and that's got to be really satisfying.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, it's edifying. That's why I spend my nights and weekends doing this, so that other people can share that experience with me.
So I've got a less serious question for you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
I have been loving one of the little Easter eggs, folks listening, that I want you to look for is how Jonathan closes every episode with describing the location and how the show has been produced.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that? Where did that originate, or was it just by accident?
It was a little bit. It was kind of by accident. I think I was tracking the first episode of the show, or maybe it was the second one. I can't remember when it started, but I was tracking an episode, and there was just a really, really loud car passing by. We live in between two major thoroughfares in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn. And occasionally there'll just be like a stampede of cars passing by, or sports cars without mufflers. It's New York. It's loud. The city we're in one of the quietest streets in North Brooklyn, and it's still always loud. And so just that idea that we were sort of sneaking out these stories in between the noise and the clamor of our lives and of the world was probably where conceptually that little bit sort of kept itself in the show over time. But I think I was probably just tracking the show and being like, Arrvls is written, produced, and recorded, and then boom. And then I just probably said it out loud and was like, oh, okay, well, there you go. There's in between the noise of passing cars. All right, that's our signature now.
But it became a thing now.
Yeah.
Because now each episode.
Yeah, each episode.
Do you think of it as a thing now? Or are you like thinking, what am I going to say to wrap this up? Like,
yeah, I do. I mean, it is a thing now. I don't plan it. It's just sort of like I try to make it something about an episode. So, for example, we did. And I should mention, too, that in addition to our individual narratives, we do these sort of historic pieces occasionally about people who have experienced some kind of remarkable transformation, migration, or change in their life through the annals of history. So we try to find interesting characters and we sort of recreate their lives occasionally. We did this for our season finale with D.B. Cooper, the man who skyjacked a plane in the 1970s,
really?
Extorted $200,000 from the federal government, and jumped out the back of the plane with a parachute and was never found again. I can't say that more succinctly. It's quite a complicated story, but worth taking a look at. And we did that earlier in the season, that same sort of format, with the story of Black Herman, who was a magician who lived in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s, and was most well known for this buried alive trick. And the buried alive trick became so renowned that when he died on stage of a heart attack, the audience couldn't believe that he had actually died, and his assistant had to host viewings of his body. And so I went out in search of his grave, which was apparently in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx here in New York. And so that's sort of the subject of episode 4 of Arrvls, the private graveyard of Black Herman. But when we were doing that episode, just to get back to the signature for a second, when we were doing that episode, I had recently discovered that there was a cemetery plot just a couple of blocks down the street from me, on my street, the cemetery had been relocated, but there was now an apartment where it was like a condo where that cemetery used to be. And so I just thought it was appropriate to mention that, we recorded our story underneath the a cemetery with mysterious auspices, if you will.
I'll tell you, there's something about that signature, and I don't want to break this down too much, technically speaking, but it's something I'm missing, and I really want to come up with something, because for those of you who listen to, and many of you do, This American Life, they have one at the end, right, where they talk about what was it, their big boss or something like that, and Ira Glass.
Torrey Malatia, yeah.
There you go. Yep, there's something there. There's something in what you guys are doing, and there's several other shows that a completely unrelated show, Pocket Now Weekly, a tech show that I listen to. They have a really unique outro in terms of talking about what each of the hosts tweet about, and there's always this little written line about what each host is tweeting about.
Right.
So follow them on Twitter, and it's for fans, for people who listen, show in and show out. They know about it, they've learned it, and they are sure to stay tuned, so to speak, all the way to the end.
Right.
As a mass listener, it is very easy that sort of when the main show ends to just skip to the next thing.
Right.
But there's so much importance that happens oftentimes in that last 30, 60, 90 seconds, especially from a host perspective, where either you're giving out credits or thank yous or follows or announcements, and just having something like that in there sort of ensures people aren't going to skip it because they want to hear how is this going to wrap up this week. And I think it's an excellent tool, intended or not, accident or on purpose. I love it. I think it's great.
Oh, that's cool. Well, it's funny. I feel like this theme keeps recurring in our conversation today. I always feel a little bit odd about taking agency of some of the format and stylistic values of our show, because I feel like I came at it from a very different angle. And it's one of the great things about podcasting and podcasters is that we don't all arrive here in the same way. And so for me,
no pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. No pun intended. Oh my God. All the Arrvls jokes that I get now from my friends. It's just unceasing. I'll be arriving.
Somebody gets home
there.
And sends you a text.
Yeah.
I've arrived home. I can imagine.
Oh man, every day. Do
they include the vowels when they send you that?
Never. But, I started, I like to think of these things as a composition, these stories. Not only are they someone else's story, but we're composing a almost like a song that they, in their voice with their lyrics, and so, and that's obviously, from my experience as a musician and as a songwriter, it's just the first way that I thought to think about it. Like, I wasn't an AP for a public radio show. I didn't get experience through the networks. I learned this on my own, so I had to use the tools that were at my disposal to sort of invent how I wanted these things to look and sound. So for me, I always drew upon music and composition and song form to sort of lead me in ways that maybe just instructions or other people's perspectives weren't. And when we started to put together things like the credit roll, that was the first thing I thought of. Songs all have we know a song is ending in a variety of different ways, because of format, because of certain chord changes, because of, the way that the tempo and the rhythm changes at the end of a song. We have different ways of seeing it that way. And I think that producing a story is really no different. So when we use certain signature ways of wrapping up a story or closing it, we're doing it in much the same way that one would do with a composition.
I think it's excellent the way that you've put that together, and I think folks will, if for nothing else, folks, look out for that. And trust me, each episode there's something new, and Jonathan does a great job. Kind of literally cherry on top of something that was already excellent that you just heard. And so,
thank you.
Before I let you go today, Jonathan, I want to talk about future plans for the show. You've talked a little bit about some live shows, and we've talked at length of the plans there, and obviously season 2's coming up. But tell folks about that, and even beyond. Any ideas, big ideas? Where do you see things going?
Yeah, I have a lot, and I won't labor your listeners with all of them. I would hope that they would come to us and take a listen and see what we're up to, because we have a lot of things planned for the future. But I will say probably the most exciting thing that's happening, and this is back to this point of the show and this medium migrating into this sense of community that we've certainly discovered in spades since starting Arrvls. But I, about a month or two ago, maybe it's a little bit longer, probably, a few months ago, I came across a show online, again, just searching for other shows, looking for people with different perspectives, I came across a show called Neighbors by a producer out of Nashville, Tennessee, named Jacob Lewis. And Neighbors was all about those interactions that we have with the people that live around us, stories of, people that were impacted by their neighbors or in one way or another impacted by their immediate community. And it was done in such a great way and produced so engagingly that I was immediately hooked. And so I reached out to the producer, and he listened to my show, and we immediately found this simpatico with each other. And he invited me shortly thereafter to be part of this new project that he was starting, a collective of other storytelling podcasters of like minds. And both of us had experienced, since getting involved in the storytelling podcast community, that there was a wealth of incredible stories that you've mentioned too earlier in today's broadcast, that are out there, amazing people that are just doing this from their bedroom, that are just doing this in their spare time, that are seeing this as an opportunity to express themselves in a way that no other platform has allowed them the opportunity to do. And so he began to develop, and I began to help him develop this collective of other storytelling podcasts, and it's called The Herd, Heard. And I think you have had one of our members on your show, Vanessa Lowe of Nocturne. Yes. In any case, we are now a team of 6, possibly 7, and we're going to be launching The Herd, I guess, probably a few days after this airs. And the idea here is that we share we share resources with one another, our wisdom, perspective. We help each other do recordings of guests in other cities when we can't be there. We maybe will produce events together. In any case, we are now creating what's not quite a network, because we're not doing it to monetize our shows. We're doing it to make our shows better and to share each other's shows with the world. It's a kind of collective. So that's probably the thing that I'm most excited about, that Arrvls is a part of, that a show called First Day Back by the Montreal-based producer Tally Abacassis is a part of, an incredible show called How to Be a Girl by Marlo Mack is going to be a part of, and an awesome show from St. Paul, or from the Minneapolis area, called Anxious Machine by Rob McGinley Myers. It's stories about anxiety and technology. All of these shows have a very particular quality to them, which is they're individually produced programs by people that are doing it on their own. We're independent producers, and we want to stay that way. And we're helping each other continue to do things independently, and to share different kinds of stories with all of our audiences.
So definitely something to look out for,
yes,
there, folks. I mean, I've already introduced you now to Nocturne and Arrvls. I can tell you the Anxious Machine I also subscribe to and listen to, and Neighbors and I have followed each other on Twitter for a while now. They're also on my list. So already with this much quality inside this collective, it's going to be worth your time and your earballs and your subscriptions. So keep a lookout for that. This could be one of those. I remember when they just started and they were on my little show, and now look at them. It could be one of those situations. Before we go, Jonathan, please tell everyone where they can find Arrvls and anything else you're doing online you'd like to tell them about.
Absolutely. So we are on all forms of social media. We have a Twitter, a Facebook, a SoundCloud, an Instagram account, which we use quite regularly, and I'm surprised that there aren't more podcasters out there doing it. We like to have a lot of fun with it. All of these things can be found on our website. Our website is arrvls.com. And you can find links to... We like to write little articles about the show and different themes that are interesting to us. Those are there. We have a sort of microcast of the show in which we tell these sort of short 3 to 8 minute snippets of stories of people that have experienced some form of migration, transformation, or change. It's called En Route. You can find that there as well as links to the Herd when we launch at the end of this month, and anything else related to our show. So yeah, again, that's arrvls.com.
Excellent. And as I mentioned before, folks, those links will all be in the show notes as well, and you can hop right on over there. Subscribe and follow Jonathan and Arrvls and all the work that his team and soon to be the collective will be doing in the near future. Jonathan, it has been a great conversation. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join me here on the Podcast Digest.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's been a pleasure, and you're doing great work. I'm looking forward to continuing to hear all of your excellent interviews.
Well, we certainly try. And folks, I want to thank you for taking the time once again to listen. If you do have any more time, a rating or review on iTunes or Stitcher would be greatly appreciated. Until next week, when hopefully I will come up with the catchy thing to say right here. My name's Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest, and I will talk to you again soon.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.